Most of us begin with a very quiet, almost unquestioned assumption that somewhere inside all this activity, the thinking, the remembering, the reacting, there is a someone, a center, a thing we call me. Not the body exactly, not the thoughts exactly, but something behind them. A separate self who owns the experiences, who moves through time carrying a personal story like a passport. And this assumption is rarely dramatic. It doesn't arrive as a philosophical problem. It arrives in ordinary sentences. This happened to me. I am like this because I've always been this kind of person. It hides in memory. It hides in explanation. It hides in the feeling that there is a narrator living just behind the eyes, watching life unfold like a film in which they are both actor and audience. Yet it's curious how fragile this sense of a separate self actually is. Consider something non-human, something utterly ordinary, a cloud drifting across the sky, or a wave rising and collapsing in the ocean. We don't ask where the wave goes when it disappears. We don't assume there is a wave self hiding underneath the water, carrying its history forward. The wave appears, takes a shape, moves with force and intention, at least it seems that way, and then dissolves back into what it always was. Water moving. Patterns arising and vanishing. And yet, when it comes to our own experience, we insist on something extra. We insist that behind the movement of thoughts, behind the shifting moods and roles, there must be a permanent entity holding it all together. A separate self who remains the same while everything else changes. Now, this is where the metaphor quietly enters, without announcing itself. Imagine a storyteller sitting by a fire, weaving tales late into the night. Each story refers to earlier ones. Characters reappear. Motifs repeat. Conflicts echo past conflicts. Over time, the stories form a coherent saga, so coherent, in fact, that it begins to feel like there must be a single author behind it all. But what if the storyteller is not a person at all, but the fire itself? Crackling, shifting, responding to wind and fuel. The stories arise because the conditions allow them to arise. Personal identity often works like this. A memory appears, then another links to it. An emotion adds color. A label is applied. Soon there is a narrative thread. This is who I am. Not because anyone decided it consciously, but because continuity feels comforting. It feels stabilizing to believe there is a fixed point in the middle of all this flux. And so the idea of a separate self becomes less like a discovery and more like a habit. A habit of interpretation. A habit of organizing experience into a storyline with a central character. What's fascinating is how rarely this character is experienced directly. You can feel sensations, pressure, warmth, tension. You can hear thoughts sometimes loud, sometimes faint, sometimes contradictory. You can notice emotions shifting like weather patterns. But the self who supposedly owns all of this is strangely elusive. It is always inferred, never quite found, like a reflection assumed to exist because the mirror is busy. Over time, perception tightens around this inference. Moments are no longer just moments. They become evidence. Every success confirms the story. Every failure threatens it. Every interaction feels personal because it is filtered through the need to protect, enhance, or explain the character at the center. And slowly, very slowly, identity hardens, not into something solid, but into something defended. A posture forms. This is me, and this is not me. Experiences that fit the story are welcomed. Those that don't are resisted, justified, or forgotten. What began as a simple narrative convenience becomes a psychological structure, a structure that must be maintained, a structure that now carries tension, because stories are fragile things when mistaken for reality. And yet, even here, nothing has gone wrong. This is simply how stories behave when they are believed too literally. They ask to be continued. They ask to be protected. They ask to make sense of everything that follows. So the question quietly shifts not toward solving anything, but toward noticing. Is there truly a separate self standing apart from experience? Or is there experience unfolding, telling stories about itself as it goes. And that question doesn't demand an answer. It simply lingers, like smoke above the fire, waiting to be seen rather than grasped. Once the idea of a separate self settles in, it begins to do something very subtle. It starts to look backward. It scans memory the way an archivist scans shelves, searching for proof. Proof that this me has continuity. Proof that it existed yesterday, 10 years ago, in childhood. And what it finds are stories, fragments of recollection, stitched together into something that feels solid, simply because it has been repeated. It's worth noticing how strange memory actually is. Not in theory, but in lived experience. A memory doesn't arrive as a full, stable object. It flickers, it shifts, it changes tone depending on mood, context, and time. The same event remembered at 20 feels different when remembered at 40. The facts may resemble each other, but the meaning does not stay put. Yet the self-story treats memory as if it were evidence in a courtroom. This happened, therefore I am this kind of person. Because I reacted that way, that must be who I really am. But memory behaves less like a record and more like a performance. Each recall is a recreation. Each telling subtly rewrites the teller. Imagine again something ordinary, a path worn into the grass. No one planned it. No one declared, this is the official route. People simply walked the same way often enough that the ground responded. The path looks intentional, but it is only repetition made visible. Identity forms in much the same way. Certain reactions repeat. Certain roles are reinforced. Certain descriptions stick. Soon there appears to be a personality, a character, a true self. But what's really there is a groove, a familiar route through experience. And grooves have momentum. Once formed, they invite more of the same. Not because they are true, but because they are easy. This is where perception subtly narrows. New experiences are filtered through old interpretations. Unexpected feelings are translated into familiar language. Even change itself gets absorbed into the storyline. This is how I've changed. This is the new version of me. Notice how even transformation is often framed as a better or worse chapter of the same protagonist. The self survives every revision. It must, otherwise the story would collapse. And here, tension quietly enters. Because life does not actually cooperate with narratives. Moments arise that do not fit. Emotions appear without explanation. Reactions happen that feel foreign, embarrassing, or out of character. When that happens, the sense of a separate self feels threatened. Something seems to be going wrong. There is confusion, self-doubt, sometimes anxiety, not because anything is objectively wrong, but because the story is losing coherence. The mind responds by tightening its grip. More analysis, more labeling, more effort to figure out who I really am. As if clarity could be achieved by sharpening the definition. But this effort often produces the opposite effect. The more tightly identity is held, the more brittle it becomes. Every contradiction feels personal. Every uncertainty feels like a flaw. What's rarely noticed is that the tension does not come from experience itself. Experience is simply happening sensations, thoughts, encounters, changes. The tension comes from the demand that all of this must belong to a single, stable owner. Like insisting that a river keep the same shape while it flows. The water moves, the banks shift, the current changes speed. Yet the name of the river remains, and we mistake the name for the thing itself. Everyday life quietly reinforces this confusion. Work introduces roles. Relationships introduce expectations. Time introduces pressure. Each context asks the same silent question: who are you here? And the story obliges, offering a version that seems appropriate. But these versions are not masks hiding a true self. They are simply responses. Contextual, temporary, functional. The difficulty arises only when one of them is crowned as the real one. When identity becomes a possession rather than a description. When the story is mistaken for the storyteller. And so the inquiry deepens, not by force, but by fatigue? What if the exhaustion comes not from life being too much, but from carrying a character through every moment of it? The thought doesn't resolve anything. It doesn't dismantle identity. It simply loosens the seriousness with which the story is held. And in that loosening, something interesting happens. Experience begins to feel a little wider. Not better, not worse, just less confined to a single point called me. As this loosening happens quietly, without ceremony, the sense of identity doesn't disappear. It simply starts behaving differently. Less like a solid object and more like a process unfolding in real time. What becomes noticeable is how much effort goes into maintaining the feeling of being a separate self. Not dramatic effort, micro effort. Constant, almost invisible adjustment. There is the effort of positioning, deciding how one stands in relation to others. The effort of interpretation, deciding what events mean about who one is. The effort of continuity, making sure today still makes sense in light of yesterday. All of this happens so automatically that it feels natural. But once it's noticed, it begins to look more like balancing than being. Like standing on a moving surface and constantly shifting weight to stay upright. And here, something ordinary offers itself as another metaphor. Think of a tightrope walker crossing a line stretched high above the ground. To an observer, it looks graceful, controlled, deliberate. But from within the experience, it is continuous correction, tiny movements responding to instability. The sense of a separate self often feels the same. Poised, intentional. But internally, it is a stream of adjustments responding to change, uncertainty, and unpredictability. The moment this effort relaxes, even slightly, something unexpected is noticed. Life does not fall apart. Decisions still happen, conversations still unfold, preferences still arise. What softens is not functioning, but ownership. Thoughts occur without needing to be claimed. Emotions pass without requiring explanation. Actions happen without the constant commentary of "this says something about me." This is often where confusion appears. If there is no fixed self at the center, what is living this life? Who is listening? Who is choosing? Who is responsible? But notice how quickly the mind tries to replace one certainty with another. If the old identity dissolves, a new framework is demanded. A subtler self, a truer self, a deeper observer behind the observer. Yet this too is just another story waiting to harden. The difficulty is not in having stories. Stories are unavoidable. Language itself creates them. The difficulty comes from believing that one of these stories is the final authority on reality. That somewhere behind all appearances, there must be a permanent witness holding it all together. What if experience does not need a manager? Consider how listening happens. Sounds appear: traffic, voices, wind, without effort. There is no separate listener directing the process. Hearing simply occurs when conditions allow it. Thoughts behave in much the same way. They arise uninvited. They comment, argue, remember, imagine, all without a central command. And yet, because thoughts talk about a me, it feels as though there must be one. The narrative implies a narrator, but implication is not evidence. A sentence containing the word I does not prove the existence of an independent entity behind it. It only proves that language is doing what language does. This becomes especially clear in moments of disruption. Grief, shock, deep joy, sudden danger. In these moments, the self-story often falls silent. There is just response, just presence, just what is happening. Afterward, the narrative returns to explain what occurred. That was intense. I wasn't myself. I lost control. But notice the phrasing, as if there were a self that briefly stepped away. Perhaps what actually happened was simpler. The story paused. Life continued without commentary. In everyday life, the story rarely stops completely, but it can thin. Moments of absorption in work, music, conversation, movement reveal this clearly. When attention is fully engaged, the separate self is strangely absent, and yet nothing feels missing. This absence is not dramatic. It does not feel like enlightenment or transcendence. It feels ordinary, functional, unremarkable, which may be why it is so often overlooked. The idea of a separate self thrives on significance, on importance, on being someone rather than something happening. So when experience reveals itself as simple and immediate, it can feel almost disappointing. Where is the grand realization? Where is the final answer? But perhaps that expectation itself belongs to the story, a story that insists there must be something more than this moment, just as it is. And here, without pushing any conclusion, the inquiry begins to turn gently toward daily life again. Not as a problem to be solved, but as a field to be noticed. How often does identity show up as tension, as self-monitoring, as the feeling of being slightly out of place inside one's own experience? And what happens, even briefly, when that tension is allowed to soften, not eliminated, just ungripped? These questions don't ask for solutions. They don't demand answers. They simply invite a different quality of attention. And attention, when it is no longer contracted around a central character, has a curious way of opening on its own. As attention opens in this quieter way, everyday life begins to look slightly unfamiliar. Not strange or mystical, just less edited. Time, for example, loses some of its usual weight. Moments are no longer constantly measured against a personal timeline where one should be, what one should have become by now. There is still memory, still anticipation, but they no longer feel like evidence being gathered for a case about who one is. Work happens. Tasks are completed. Emails are sent. Conversations unfold. Plans are made. But the sense that all of this must say something definitive about a separate self starts to loosen. A bad day is less of a verdict. A good day is less of a trophy. Not because life has been reinterpreted positively, but because the interpreter is no longer standing at the center demanding meaning from every event. Relationships reveal this especially clearly. So much tension in human connection comes from identity meeting identity, from two stories negotiating space, recognition, validation. When the sense of a fixed self softens, interactions change texture. There is more listening, not as a skill, but as a natural response. Less rehearsal of what one is about to say. Less after-the-fact editing of what one should have said. People appear less as characters in a personal drama, and more as movements of their own histories, moods, and pressures. Not objects to be managed, not mirrors reflecting one's worth, but living processes intersecting briefly. Loss, too, takes on a different shape. Grief still hurts. Absence still aches. But there is less of a secondary pain layered on top the pain of what the loss says about me, about my story, about what should have been. Sadness moves as weather moves, without requiring a permanent owner. Even anxiety, when it appears, is seen differently. Not as a personal flaw or a failure of self-mastery, but as a signal of contraction. A moment when experience has tightened around a story that feels threatened. Anxiety thrives on the belief that there is something at stake, a self that could be diminished, exposed, or undone. When that belief loosens, anxiety doesn't vanish, but it loses some of its authority. It becomes an event, not an identity. None of this creates a new role to inhabit. There is no replacement self waiting in the wings. No deeper character who finally gets it right. There is simply this experience unfolding, with stories appearing inside it rather than standing above it. And this is where the question from the beginning quietly transforms. Not who is the real you, but whether the question itself was built on an assumption that never quite needed to be there. Perhaps there is no separate self to locate, refine, or dissolve. Perhaps there is only the habit of telling personal stories, useful, functional, sometimes heavy, moving through a field of immediate experience. And when that habit relaxes, even slightly, what remains is not emptiness or confusion. It is something remarkably simple: Colors are still colors. Sounds are still sounds. Thoughts still come and go, offering interpretations, explanations, concerns. But none of it requires a center to orbit around. Life does not need to be owned to be lived. It does not need a narrator to continue unfolding. It does not need a separate self to justify its movement from one moment to the next. This is not a conclusion. It is not an answer. It is more like noticing that the ground one has been standing on was never quite as solid or as necessary as it seemed. And in that noticing, there is a subtle easing. Not a solution, not a revelation. Just a quieter way of being with what is already happening. The story may return tomorrow. It usually does. But perhaps it will be held a little more lightly, like a tale told around a fire, meaningful, engaging, sometimes moving yet never mistaken for the fire itself.